Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, we have to talk about sustainable design as well. And I have a very special guest today. I'm so excited. I've got Caleb Crawford from the New York City School Construction Authority today. Caleb, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
It is absolutely my pleasure and my honor. Let's start by letting our listeners learn a little bit about you. Tell us about your career. Tell us why you chose architecture, and you're probably going to mention Legos. Everybody mentions the Legos, but anyway, I still want to hear it. Tell us about how you chose architecture and how you ended up as the Director of Sustainable Design and Resiliency. Director of Sustainable Design and Resiliency at the New York City School Construction Authority. That's a mouthful.
Yeah. Actually, I wasn't going to talk about the Legos, although that was certainly a part of my childhood. Yeah, I am a born New Yorker, and actually the first 5 years were like half a block from the main portal of St. John the Divine. I first saw my first floor plans when I was 7 years old, and with just like a little indication, I understood immediately what I was looking at. I understood the abstraction, and I actually started drawing floor plans in second grade. I wish I had some of them. And when I was in grade school, the first Earth Day. So those are sort of the two parallel kind of like germs that were planted, right? So, and there was a lot happening in New York City around the issues of environmental pollution, nuclear waste, all the rest of that, right? In high school, kind of diverged a little bit. Most of my friends were artists and musicians, and I took a lot of art classes, but I also had this weird technical brain. Like I took all of the like AP bio, physics, chemistry, calculus, like basically everything on offer. And so when I started going to college, I was studying fine arts. And then I took a hiatus and went back to school at Pratt to get my Bachelor of Architecture, which you also had my friend Ken Levinson on. He's another Pratt grad. It was kind of the best art education that one could like have gotten, because it really took you into conceptual thinking and like gave a really strong background in compositional skills. But there was always this tension between the formal and the environmental. I mean, I took a bunch of like landscape classes at school, and then I kind of finally bridged that with my master's thesis. And then I worked for a bunch of people in allied professions, architecture, of course, but landscape, planning, urban design, interiors, before I set up shop with my wife and partner, Annie Kogan. And we had our own practice for almost 30 years. And we've been knocked down many times due to like financial depressions, right? So bubble pops. And then, you know, and actually all through that sort of 30 years, I was also teaching a lot. I taught at Pratt, I taught at Penn State, I taught in a bunch of places. I did some stints in administration. So I had this like teaching aspect to the way I did things. And I took on this job, and actually I realize now, like I had no like real corporate experience and certainly no city experience. And I think that my bosses took a big risk now that I look back after a year and a half of being there to hire somebody without that sort of basis, right? And so I've been there at SCA for a year and a half. Oh, a couple other things. I'm a lead AP accredited professional, and I'm a certified passive house designer in addition to being a registered architect.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. I want to dive right in because there's so much that I want to try to talk about today. So let's talk about your role first and foremost. How does your role shape the future of public school buildings in New York City?
So, I mean, First, I got to give a huge amount of credit to the city, like the city council, the mayor. Like New York City is very much a climate leader. And so some of the things that are being done are really beginning to push the envelopes. New York City's local laws are actually really making a difference. And and everybody's like resource constrained, and like the obligation to comply with laws makes me doing my job a whole lot easier. It's hard when you have competition for resources to justify anything that might be considered to be an additional cost. But because the local laws, the codes, all of that stuff has been actually pushing like sustainability to a huge extent. My position that I'm in now was actually created after a local law 86 that required all new buildings to be LEED certified. And so before that, this like nobody had even thought about doing that. And actually, we've seen that this has happened. Like we saw this in the federal government, and it began this whole growth of similar positions, both in the private and the public sector. So these laws have actually progressed significantly. Targets on operational greenhouse gas reductions. We're looking at embodied carbon reductions now. And let's see, climate resiliency design guidelines are a recent thing that was added in terms of a local law that we're building into. So there's a lot of structure behind it.
A forward-thinking leadership team at probably the most famous city in the world. That is heartening. That is really nice to hear.
Well, let's just put it up there. There's some pretty great cities in this world.
For sure. It's certainly the most well-known, I would guess, and I'm guessing, but my North American-centric sort of perspective. Forgive me to all my friends in Europe and Asia. Let's talk about resilience. Resilient design is an important part of your role. It's something that I barely even heard of as little as 2 years ago. And now resilience is that it's been tacked on a lot of titles. It's been tacked on a lot of objectives. So let's talk about the weather events that you're most concerned about for New York City.
Yeah. Well, obviously coastal flooding from like stormwater surge, because it's been more than a decade since Sandy hit New York City. And I live in an area called Red Hook, which is very low down, and like many of my neighbors were hit. Fortunately, our building wasn't hit. So that actually became a big topic of discussion just like at that time. And so I mentioned a minute ago, like the climate resiliency design guidelines that have been put forward, like the mayor's office of climate and environmental justice have been putting all of that together after we had a local law in 2021 that dictated that we have to deal with 3 primary threats, right? Coastal flooding due to either storm surge or sea level rise, rainwater events, and heat. Extreme heat.
Right.
And so, you look at New York City, like New York City has had many other things. Like recently we've had earthquakes, we've had wildfires, obviously hurricanes, tornadoes. We've had tornadoes in New York City. So, and many of those things are actually addressed in the building codes already. Certainly earthquake resilience and hurricane force winds are already sort of dealt with. But these things that are actually growing threats that actually are like those haven't been really addressed in our building codes. So that's where the climate resiliency design guidelines start to come in, and they're beginning to develop a metric for how, to assess a site. And they provided a whole bunch of tools to do that as well.
What makes a home truly extraordinary? Not just how it looks, but how it feels. Solera Reserve transforms daylight into soft, comfortable light. Privacy without blinds. Beauty without compromise. By day, refined and luminous. By night, an unforgettable glow. Solera Reserve. Luxury glass, designed for living. Learn more at advancedglazings.com/Solera Reserve.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting. I live in rural Nova Scotia, a long way from New York City. Well, I mean, long way in terms of the
Driving
type
time.
of area. Yeah, for sure. It's a quick flight from Halifax to New York, so it's not that far away in those regards, but it's a very different place. But I mean, 2 years ago, almost to the day, we had Hurricane Fiona, which was absolutely devastating. I mean, we were almost
Wow.
2 weeks without power, which is unheard of. Like, this is a modern country, and we went almost 2 weeks without power, which was phenomenal. They brought in the army. Last winter, we had 6 feet of snow fall on a weekend,
Wow.
which was where did that come from? I mean, we've always had lots of snow, but never in such a short time period. That was phenomenal, or at least not in my lifetime. And then this summer, we're struggling with drought. And this is Nova Scotia is New Scotland, right? This is freaking
Yeah.
Scotland, and normally a drizzly, rainy, wet sort of place. And my lawn on my backyard is completely brown, and much of it is just not going to recover. And I can't water it. I live rural, so I'm on a well. I'm scared to death about draining my well. Anyway, some very consequential changes, and resilience is definitely top of mind for me. Let's talk schools. So enough about me. Let's get back to schools. What does a resilient school look like to you? You've got some pretty serious uncertainty. The three big events that you spoke of there are very consequential.
Yeah.
What steps do you take to start to prepare for those eventualities?
So let's see. What steps do we take? I mean, that's where the climate resiliency design guidelines come in.
What kinds of things are in
Schools,
those guidelines, Caleb? Like
yeah.
what's
So, I mean, it runs the gamut depending on what is like. There's green infrastructure requirements. There's lighter materials, so dealing with the heat island effect. There's the elevation of schools if you're in a flood prone zone, or everything that's code required in terms of either wet flood proofing or dry flood proofing, right? And ultimately, we may not actually be able to build in certain areas if the prediction is that those areas are going to be inundated by, like, we're expected the 60-year mark for our buildings. And so 2085, right? We're seeing large areas of the Rockaways being potentially tidally underwater, like all of the coastal regions of New York City. And it's an issue. We're not considered to be critical facilities, so there's different kind of categories. We like the ability to recover just easily to misfortune or change, right? That's the Merriam-Webster. I like that. It's a nice, concise definition.
right?
And I think of that actually because there's like the things I learned as an architect, right? There's three goals of fire safety: preservation of life, preservation of facilities, and the continuity of operations. And I actually seen recently like a fourth one, which is environmental protection, so that if you do have an issue, then you're not like creating toxic conditions, right?
Right.
And so we're not really required to provide the continuity of operations that, say, like a first responder facility, like a hospital, police station, fire station is required to provide, right?
Right.
And so, I talked about some of the measures in this, but there's also another thing. I kind of call myself a fundamentalist, jokingly, meaning I believe in fundamental building design first. There's a concept called passive survivability, in which, like, if in the event that systems are down, that the building has an ability to coast. So thermally, right? You still probably
Right.
have to open up windows for ventilation, but this is actually a really important feature. It means that if the heat goes off, we don't freeze, right? That the building will stay cool for relative period of time. Of course, anything left without conditioning will ultimately achieve the same balance with the outdoors, right? But
Yeah.
this is important. It also actually has a collateral positive, which is that it helps with load management, so that we're not actually stressing the grid. We can actually do like a set back, so we don't actually, and it'll take time for the building to kind of to slow down, right?
Right.
And we've been looking at other things that have to do with, say, the heat island effect, right? Like most of like what LEED has in it is like cool roofs and things like that. But we're actually looking at like the vertical surfaces, because anybody that's walked past a west facing wall in the afternoon in the summer in New York, that's like a brick masonry, you feel the heat like
Yep.
throbbing, shooting off of it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. There was this twice today. I've recorded 2 episodes today, which I never do, but it just kind of worked out that I had to record 2 today. And the first one, we just talked about urban heat island as well. And it reminded me of a conversation that I'd had, in the very early days of this podcast with Dr. Jakubiak at the University of Toronto, who studied mitigation of urban heat island effect. And the only thing that worked was green space. Like, of all the different methodologies that he studied, the paper that he was talking about, it concluded that the only methodology that consistently worked and actually lowered temperatures was green space. And that included rooftop green space too. But green space in general provided a tremendous amount of cooling. Interesting that it came up again today, but I guess if we're talking about resilience, then of course it would come up. Let's talk about equity and environmental justice. How do you approach equity and environmental justice in school construction in your district?
Yeah, well, district, I mean, it's a system, right? That's composed of, I should know it, but I don't know how many districts, right?
Right, sorry, your system, yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's still kind of in awe of my job, like that there's like 1 million students plus or minus in our system. It's the largest. It's twice the size of LA, 3 times the size of Chicago and Miami-Dade, right? So it really is quite enormous. So all new buildings that we build, like there's equality is built into it, because it's like we're built on a set of standards at SCA, because we have such a quick turnaround that needs to be met, that our consultants and our in-house teams they work off of these, standard specifications, standard details, right? Like they deviate, right? And they apply for deviations, but for the most part, room planning standards, all the rest of that stuff. So, a building built in like a challenged neighborhood in Queens versus like in downtown Manhattan, they're all like being required to comply with the same level of standards, same sizes of rooms, right? Where schools get built is like largely determined by the Department of Education. They look where they have needs, right? Like where they need to have seats. And our Green Schools Guide, which is basically a LEED equivalent, basically, except that we don't actually score schools. We don't like say, okay, this school got a green, like just got certified, this school got like platinum, right? We don't do that because it could be showing some kind of favoritism, right? There's a citywide mandate to reduce class size, because sometimes we push up to 30 students in a classroom. So to reduce that overcrowding, there's a mandate to bring that down to 25. So we're building yet more schools. Some of the tools that I mentioned, like the climate resiliency design guidelines, they have like a whole bunch of mapping tools that actually lay out the demographics, and they assess risk, like the heat island effect risk in particular isn't just based on that it's hotter in that neighborhood. They have a whole bunch of factors, including health incomes, that are often based on demographics, right? Like neighborhoods that are like poorer neighborhoods tend to have worse health outcomes. So they actually have a much higher risk factor for heat. So they're really trying to address systemic inequalities through the way that they're designing and thinking about the tools they use.
That is brilliant. Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, and then also we do a careful environmental assessment of every school that we build. We do soil testing, we do air testing, noise, right? Because we're running out of choice sites in New York City. We're pretty built up. And so we are building in areas that are less than ideal. And so like one recent school was right up against an elevated train. And so we had to do a very careful acoustical analysis of the school. We look at the businesses in the area. If we have to, we put in like air sampling testing. And if we see that there are specific emissions coming from certain areas, we actually do computational fluid dynamic modeling to see what will happen. And then we'll reposition the equipment and air intakes, all the rest of that stuff to deal with that kind of thing.
It's funny. I'm pretty sure that Solero is used in that project close to the L train, not because of the daylighting, but because of the high sound transmittance class. I'm pretty sure. I'd have to go back and check.
Yeah, I'm not positive. Yeah, there was one project that went on hold for MTA reasons, but that was the one I've been there a year and a half, so I haven't seen everything.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I gotcha. It's interesting. I was actually going to ask you if there's anything that you do specifically to deal with schools in a marginalized neighborhood or marginalized community. And you answered that brilliantly with the fact that the risk factors will drive, a different focus, a different set of focus in order, so it's just built in. You don't have to sit down and have a big discussion. It's literally just built into the system. That's a lovely way to do it. My hat's off to New York for that one. Now, let's talk about what you just brought up. You're running out of space. It's a very dense urban environment. The constraints are somewhat unique, So what are some, I'll say, site-specific strategies that you've used to integrate green infrastructure, passive design into these really tight spaces or schools that, a historical school that's been there for a while? Yeah, let's focus on that. Let's focus on existing schools. How are you dealing with them in that super dense environment?
Yeah, well, New York is a big place, right? And so what we think of like the sort of characteristic that Stevie Wonder, like New York, just like I pictured it, skyscrapers and everything, it's actually like a lot of our schools are in actually sort of low to medium rise neighborhoods, right? Like everything from 1-2 story houses up to 4 to 6 story buildings, and then it's really mostly like in the Manhattan or Brooklyn core that we're seeing that we have this kind of tight condition.
Right.
And even there, like going back actually to one of the first full-time architects, like Charles Schneider, he became the director of schools at the end of the 19th century when an elementary school education was first made mandatory. And he took a lot of inspiration from like other cities in Europe. And he was the first to begin to create standards where he was doing steel construction, fireproof construction. He was providing large windows for light and air, right? And so we very much have like some of the benefit of that. And another thing that we have a benefit of is the street grid pattern that was laid down in like 1811. And so lot line to lot line, we have 60 feet. And on avenues, we have like 120 feet or more. And then we have some side streets that are larger. So, and then our zoning codes also require for residential 30-foot rear yards. So we have like already built into this like a lot of light and air. Green infrastructure. By green infrastructure, I'm assuming like green roofs, bioswales, rain gardens, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
So on existing schools, they're actually a real challenge because of weight limitations.
Right.
And like when we start electrifying schools, it becomes even more of a challenge because that's where we start to put all of the equipment to run the school is up on the roof. And so in our new schools, it's certainly a challenge. We've just like, there's so much demand for the roof space. And as I mentioned, like the new school sites are often too small for the needed outdoor space. And we're having to put play space up on roofs, which we'd rather not do, It just becomes a real challenge. We are just starting to, like, there's actually a new local law, like pushing this tree canopy in New York to 30% of the land area of New York City, which is between street trees and like site-driven trees. And so that's sort of given us, we've been looking at that and we're kind of reworking our design guidelines, our design requirements to see where we can to push up the amount of trees. And this would also go for the redesign of some of the existing playgrounds. But of course, there's maintenance challenges to green stuff. So anybody that's ever tried to grow a plant, I've just started getting like reasonably good at it. I'm in my 60s. So, and watering, weeding, feeding, replanting, trying out new tree, all of that stuff is a maintenance issue that the Department of Education has to take on. And not all custodians are made equal. It does help to have it part of a curriculum, and we see that's where we've seen the most success. But custodians often have to triage where they're going to put their attention. And so it becomes, green infrastructure, it's coming, but it's a challenge, right?
Right. Yeah. I want to go off topic a little bit. And I should have asked this earlier when we were talking about resilience, but New York faced a lot of smoke.
Yes.
And from multiple, like from the Midwest, from fires in Canada.
From you guys.
Yeah, like Ontario, Manitoba, a lot of the smoke from those fires somehow ended up moving, across the border and over towards New York. Is there anything that you've had to do differently given, this sort of new reality of all these terrible fires?
Well, we've been doing MERV 13 filters on like all of our new schools, all of our electrification projects where we're fully electrifying and putting in new HVAC equipment. We're doing the MERV 13 filters, but we've got 1,400 schools. And that 1,400 schools, it becomes a slow process. And we're like right now, we're in the learning curve on the electrification. I have a feeling that we might need to start doing things like in-room air filtration so that we can actually filter the air within the room as well as like bringing in outdoor air. Because, if we just bring in outdoor air with the current means, it's really an exhaust only typical like condition. And so we're basically sucking in outdoor air or whatever quality it is and pushing it up through the roof. All of our new schools, they're doing MERV 13 filtration, also the electrification. We're doing heat recovery, energy recovery on the ventilation air. So, we're doing a lot to improve the indoor air quality. But yeah, I was actually up in Maine like that, like 2 summers ago when the skies were orange here.
Yes.
So we managed to miss it.
Forget the old paradigm that privacy means darkness. With Solera translucent glazings, architects can design spaces that are private, filled with natural light, and visually stunning. It's time to rethink how buildings work and feel. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Right. Yeah, those were strange days for sure. Let's talk about windows for just a second. The 30% window to wall ratio, the sort of prescriptive 30% window to wall ratio from ASHRAE 90.1. So you're in a situation where you've got, you just explained to me. Let's just focus on Manhattan for a second, like the super dense high rises, all that kind of stuff, that world. How do you deal with trying to bring light and provide views in schools, the restriction of that window to wall ratio while simultaneously, concrete in every direction? How are you getting sunlight into those buildings?
Well, I don't really know because we haven't actually had to deal with any of those schools recently.
Okay.
And actually, like the 30% window to wall ratio, we actually target a 20% window to wall ratio overall. Like basically it's sort of in passive house community, like 30% is basically what is the typical wisdom that you're not going to pull off a passive house building if you have a greater than 30% overall window to wall ratio. Now, that 30% overall kind of translates into somewhere around 30 to 35% for classrooms. We actually, so we do the daylight analysis on all of our schools. It's a LEED credit. We're only achieving those credits for about 30% of the schools, and mostly that has to do with the fact that our public assembly spaces, cafeterias, gyms, auditoria, they tend to be deeper footprints. And so basically that spatial daylight autonomy that you're going for, we can't achieve it because those are considered to be regularly occupied spaces. We typically are hitting it no problem in our classrooms. And we've actually been like the better consultants have been doing daylight analysis and actually tweaking with things like the window reveal, where because sometimes you get a window pocket, and they've been demonstrating that if you put that angle, you actually get a better reflection and you get better daylight penetration into the space. But also, when we start getting above 30% overall, we start to see really big glare issues. A lot of our schools from the 60s have got these ribbon window conditions, and they've got typically a 30% overall, but we're seeing 40 to 45%, 45 to 50% window to wall ratio. And you go past any of those schools and you'll see that the shades are down all the time, and so this is the thing. I mean, you can have the daylight, but if you don't have the control over it, if you're not sort of tweaking the window properties, and it's actually interesting because we just started working on a new guidelines in terms of the modeling, the predictive modeling, because this is a big issue for our VP for architecture and engineering, Thierry Perret. He's very interested in daylight and views. And so demonstrating that we have the daylight and the views and minimizing the glare, right? It's a complex issue. And then also maintaining the energy balance, right? And this is where we have a whole bunch of prescriptive standards, but personally, coming from the Passive House community, you version things and you see what is going to give you the best energy balance and the best daylighting, right? And so if you kind of version these things, then you can actually come up to a better solution. Maybe the code minimum 36% solar heat gain coefficient is not the correct, right? Maybe we should be going up. Maybe we should be going down. Certainly, we don't want to go down on the visual transmittance, right? Because that gives us the views, then the quality of the views, even if I'm sort of looking out my window at the brick wall of the neighbor over there, although it is 30 feet away, you know?
It's interesting. I mean, normally I would be jumping in promoting diffusion right here. As using diffusion, you could daylight a very large floor area with a relatively small glazing area. But you also, in this scenario, given such a small glazing area, you have to take the view, the size of the view surface very seriously as well. So it'd be an interesting balancing act. There are always interesting balancing acts, but this is a particularly interesting balancing act for me, for sure.
We actually did study them, for the previous Local Law 3132, we did a study looking at a whole bunch of energy conservation measures. And solar glazing was actually one of those energy conservation measures. And it was shown to actually have a positive effect. It has not been adopted into our standards. I mean, one, it's a proprietary product. You guys don't make anything else like it, right? Although it could potentially, there's ways to sort of figure your way around that. But there also hasn't been that big an interest in it, just mostly because of the view issue, because you're including some measure of view when you install those.
You have to get it right. I mean, I always like to put even a strip of Solera up high above normal, height. I'm only 5'8", so it doesn't have to go very high for me. But for most people, you want it up a little bit higher. And even a small strip will bring in a lot of light while providing view. But it is a balancing act that should be taken seriously. And it is about control, right? And managing the light rather than letting it create all those glare and thermal issues as well. Let's talk about the $1 million question. We've reached that point in the show, Caleb. There's a question that I ask every single guest at every show, and I ask them to answer it from whatever perspective they'd like. Okay. And that question is, what makes a great building?
Yeah, so this is where the sort of the teacher and architectural theorist in me comes in. It's great is such a culturally specific perspective, right? What is the definition? Is it to me? Is it to the organization that I represent, right? And I kind of go into this idea that we actually do need a new kind of architectural theory that is really grounded in environmentalism. There have been precious few texts that have done. James Wines's Green Architecture is actually one of those that really puts forward a theory on environmentalism. Actually, Friedensreich Hundertswasser, he's like a German architect from the 60s, and he sort of put forward this idea, right? And I contributed a chapter to my colleague Jason Callender's book called Building Cities to Last. And I talked about aesthetics, right? What makes something beautiful, and how do we reframe aesthetics in relationship to sustainability? And I broke it down into sensory, emotional, and cultural. And it privileges things like, from the sensory, the thermal and visual comfort, emotional, like physical activity and biophilia, and then the cultural, diversity, complexity, tradition and innovation, right? And so we need a lot of these things going on all at the same time. But, these things all contribute, but I don't think there's necessarily any kind of a recipe. One of the teachers at my grad school, Coy Howard, he was like, does it have it? Right? This ineffable quality. And we can analyze and we can do charts and philosophize, but usually it kind of hits you when you go into a space. And a friend of mine, Larry Scarpa, the Brooks and Scarpa award-winning architects, they're some of the leading architects in sustainability front and have been for a long time. He said the most sustainable building is the one people care about. And so you can throw all the tech you want to, you can make it net zero, or like check all the boxes, but at the end of the day, if people don't like living or working or learning there, and the community considers an eyesore, it's not going to be sustainable, and certainly then it won't be great.
Right. Oh, fantastic. All right. Before we go, one last thing, Caleb. Do you have any exciting news or announcements that you'd like to share?
Well, we're in the midst of a big electrification. Like the mayor committed to 100 schools to be electrified. I think our target is 50 by 2030. And we do expect that to ramp up as we sort of get through some of the learning curve, like finding out what equipment is actually performing for us and what's not. LEED 5 just came out, and I think they did a fantastic job, and we're in the process of reconciling that to our Green Schools Guide and the most recent local laws. We've got a campus going up. It's going to be 100% geothermal on Staten Island. We're looking at all kinds of new technology. We're looking at building integrated photovoltaics, so basically photovoltaic facades. So we're looking into thermal energy networks, from like sewers and subways, right? So we've got a lot of stuff that we're really excited about.
Lots to be excited about. That's fantastic. Caleb, I can't thank you enough. I really loved learning about what you guys are doing. I love talking to you today. Thanks so much for doing this.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. You take care.
Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.